I wasn't supposed to find the grave. When I came back to Hollow Pines, it was only supposed to be for a week long enough to clear out my parents' house, sign some papers, and hand over the keys to the real estate agent. That was it. Quick, clean, and done. But things in Hollow Pines are never that simple. The town itself seemed to resist being left behind, as if it clung to the past like ivy on an old stone wall. The roads were narrower than I remembered, the air heavier, and the woods darker. As though the sun just gave up trying to break through the canopy. And then there was the cemetery. It sat at the edge of the woods, barely maintained, the wrought iron gate rusted and hanging, crooked. My parents were buried there, side by side in the back corner, under a tree that shed brittle leaves no matter the season. Visiting their graves was supposed to be my last stop before I left town for good. That's when I found it. I was walking back toward the gate, kicking through the overgrown grass, when my shoe caught on something solid. I stumbled, cursing, and looked down to see a headstone half sunk into the earth, its surface stained and cracked with age. I should have kept walking. But something about it stopped me. Maybe it was the way the air seemed colder here, or how the sunlight seemed to dim as I stood over the grave. I crouched down, brushing away the moss and dirt to read the inscription. The words carved into the stone made my stomach drop. Liam Thomas' beloved twin. Rest now, Liam Thomas. My name. My knees buckled, and I fell back onto the grass, staring at the stone as though it might disappear, if I blinked hard enough. But it didn't. My name was still there, along with my birth date, and that word twin. I don't have a twin. At least I don't remember having one. I don't know how long I sat there, my mind spinning in circles. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was a coincidence, a strange, eerie coincidence. Maybe there had been another Liam Thomas in this town, and the dates just happened to match. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. The name, the birth date, the middle of the woods, it wasn't random. It couldn't be. My fingers brushed the base of the gravestone as I stood, and I felt something strange. It wasn't the smooth stone of the marker, but a deep groove running across the surface, like claw marks. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the cemetery, and suddenly the place felt too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves. Just the sound of my own breathing, too loud in the stillness. I left without looking back, but the image of the gravestone stayed with me, burned into my mind, like a brand. The silence felt even heavier. Hollow Pines always had a way of making silence feel alive, like it was watching you, waiting for you to notice it. I dropped my keys on the counter and headed straight for the attic. If I ever had a twin, there would be anything in the family records to prove it. The attic was a mess of old boxes, sagging under decades of forgotten memories. I waited, through the dust and cobwebs, tearing through photo albums and paperwork, growing more frustrated by the second. Nothing. No birth records. No baby pictures. And then I found the photograph. It was tucked inside an old leather-bound book, faded and creased at the edges. In it, I saw myself, or at least I thought it was me. I was young, maybe 4 or 5, sitting on the porch steps of our old house. But there was someone else in the picture, someone sitting right beside me, wearing the same clothes, the same smile. Someone identical. The other half of the photo had been torn away, jagged edges cutting through the second figure's face, as if someone had tried to erase them. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the gravestone, the inscription, the claw marks. The torn photograph was still clutched in my hand when I woke up, my fingers stiff from holding it so tightly. That was when I heard it. It was faint at first, just a whisper, like the wind brushing against the windows. But then it came. Again, clearer this time, threading through the silence like a needle. Why did you leave me? The voice was soft, childlike, but it sent a bolt of cold terror through me. I froze, straining to hear it again, but the house was silent. I wanted to believe I'd imagined it, that it was just my own guilt playing tricks on me. But when I turned toward the mirror across the room, my blood ran cold. For a split second, I saw it. A shadowy figure standing behind me, its outline faint and wavering, as though it were underwater. And then it was gone. I didn't want to believe what I saw in the mirror. My pulse thundered in my ears as I turned back, toward the empty room, my eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. Nothing. But that didn't explain the whisper, or the gravestone, or the photograph still clutched in my hand. I spent the morning pacing the house, trying to make sense of it all. The photo, the torn figure. The gravestone with my name, they had to be connected. My parents weren't the secretive type. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how little they ever talked about my early childhood. It was like my first few years had been boxed up and buried away, just like the grave. I had to know more. The first place I checked was the town records. The Hollow Pines Town Hall was a relic from another era, its wooden floors creaking underfoot and its walls lined with filing cabinets that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. I started with the birth records, my hands trembling slightly as I flipped through the fragile pages. I found my name easily enough: Liam Thomas, born March 14th, 1993. But there was no mention of a twin. No baby B, no additional birth certificate. Nothing. Frustrated, I widened my search. I combed through death records, burial permits, and anything that might explain the headstone. Finally, in an old, water-stained registry from the local church cemetery, I found it. Thomas, L.T. Infant, interred March 14th, 1993. My birth date. It didn't make sense. If there was a twin, why would my parents hide it? And why wasn't there any record of what had happened? I called the only person who might know something: Mrs. Holloway, my parents' neighbor and longtime friend. She'd been around since I was born and was always full of stories about the good old days in Hollow Pines. Mrs. Holloway answered on the second ring. "Oh, Liam," she exclaimed, her voice warm but surprised. "It's been ages since I heard from you, dear. How are you holding up?" We exchanged small talk for a while before I brought up the cemetery. "Mrs. Holloway, I found something strange yesterday," I said carefully. "A gravestone with my name on it. It says I had a twin." The line went quiet. "Mrs. Holloway." "Eerie." When she finally spoke, her voice was shaky. "Liam, it's probably best if you don't dig into that," she said. "Some things are better left in the past." But why? I pressed. Why wouldn't my parents tell me if I had a twin? What happened to them? Another long silence, and then a heavy sigh. "It wasn't your parents' fault," she said finally. "They did what they thought was right." "What does that mean?" "I shouldn't say any more," she stammered. "It's not my place." Before I could push further, she muttered an excuse about needing to tend to the garden and hung up. Her evasiveness only fueled my need for answers. I spent hours that night poring over old family photo albums, looking for any sign of another child. My fingers trembled as I flipped through each page, but it was always the same pictures of me smiling at birthday parties, opening Christmas presents, and posing for awkward school portraits. But then I found it. Tucked in the back of one album, nearly hidden beneath the cardboard, was a faded Polaroid. It was the same photo I'd found in the attic, the porch, the matching clothes, the identical faces. But this time, it wasn't torn. The other child was there. I stared at the photo, my heart pounding. There was no mistaking it, there were two of us. Two boys, the same dark hair, the same wide smiles. My twin. I turned the Polaroid over, hoping for a clue, but there was only a single word scrawled in my mother's handwriting: "Sorry." The house felt different, like it was holding its breath. I tried to sleep, but every creak and groan of the old floorboards sent my nerves jangling. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of faint laughter. It wasn't the warm, familiar laugh of a child playing. It was colder, echoing faintly through the halls, more like a taunt than a sound of joy. I sat up, my chest tightening as the laughter grew louder. Slowly, I crept out of bed and down the far hall, the wooden boards creaking beneath my bare feet. The sound was coming from the living room. As I stepped inside, the laughter stopped abruptly. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. Then I saw it. The torn Polaroid was sitting on the coffee table. I hadn't left it there. My blood ran cold as I picked it up. The edges of the photo were damp, the paper curling slightly, as though it had been submerged in water. And then I noticed the change. He was standing behind me, his face obscured by shadow, and his eyes were black. Bottomless pits. My hands trembled as I stared at the Polaroid, the air in the room suddenly feeling too thick, too cold. The black eyes of the figure in the photograph seemed to bore into me, unblinking, full of malice. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in the living room, the photo clutched in my hand, listening to the house creak and groan as though it were alive. Every sound felt purposeful, every shadow stretched a little too far. The laughter didn't return, but the silence that replaced it was worse. I made my way back to the cemetery, unable to shake the feeling that I'd missed something the first time. The gravestone loomed ahead as I approached, half sunken into the earth, its surface cracked and pitted with age. But this time, I noticed something new. The ground in front of the gravestone was disturbed, the dirt loose and uneven, as though someone or something had been digging. My stomach churned as I crouched down, running, my fingers over the claw-like grooves carved into the stone. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. Using a stick, I began to dig, the soil damp and clinging to my fingers as I worked. After several minutes, the stick hit something hard, a small metal box, rusted and dented with age. I pried it open, my breath catching as I saw what was inside. A bracelet, tarnished and corroded, engraved with the initials LT. My initials. The bracelet felt unnaturally cold in my hand, and as I held it, a sudden wave of dizziness washed over me. The world blurred, and for a moment I wasn't in the cemetery anymore. I saw two boys standing in a dimly lit room. One of them was me, I was sure of it, even though I looked younger, no older than 6. The other boy was identical to me, but his face was twisted with anger, his eyes wild with something between fury and fear. They were shouting, though I couldn't make out the words. The other boy shoved me hard and I stumbled backward, crashing into a mirror. The glass spiderwebbed with cracks and the reflection of the two boys warped and twisted, as though it were alive. Then the vision shifted. I saw my parents, their faces pale and drawn. My mother held the bracelet, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "I'm so sorry." And then came the final image, the same gravestone I'd found in the cemetery, the fresh dirt piled high around it. "You promised," a voice hissed in my ear, pulling me back to the present. I gasped, the bracelet falling from my hands as I staggered back, my head pounding. The cemetery was silent again, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. I couldn't go back to the house. Not yet. Instead, I drove to the library, hoping to find answers in the town's history. Hollow Pines had always been steeped in superstition, and the cemetery wasn't its only secret. I found a local historian tucked away in the corner of the library, a wiry man named Mr. Greaves, who looked as though he hadn't seen sunlight in decades. When I mentioned the gravestone and the bracelet, his expression darkened. "There have been stories about twins in this town," he said, lowering his voice as though the walls themselves might overhear. "Twins born under what the villagers used to call the cursed moon. People said they were mirrors, two sides of the same soul. One was destined to live, and the other two, well, to suffer. Suffer how?" I asked, my throat dry. Sometimes the weaker one would waste away, dying in infancy. Other times he hesitated, his bony fingers drumming on the desk. Other times, the parents would take matters into their own hands. I swallowed hard. What does that mean? They believed that if the twin destined to suffer was allowed to live, it would bring ruin to the family, madness, death, misfortune. So they got rid of them, buried them alive, cast them out into the woods. Or worse. A chill ran down my spine. And the grave? The bracelet. Mr. Greaves leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. The grave may not be empty, he said, but whatever's in it isn't resting. I left the library shaken, my mind spinning with Mr. Greaves's words. The vision I'd seen at the cemetery, the photograph, the gravestone, none of it felt like coincidence anymore. I drove home, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, and stepped into the house with a sense of dread. The bracelet was still in my pocket, its cold weight pressing against me like an accusation. As I set it on the kitchen table, I noticed something new. The torn Polaroid, still damp from the night before, was now lying beside it. The figure in the photo had moved again. This time it was standing directly in front of me, its shadowy outline blurred but unmistakable. My phone buzzed suddenly, breaking the silence. It was a message from an unknown number. Come home. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. The message was short, but it filled me with a terrible certainty. The message wasn't about the house. It was about the grave. The message on my phone glared at me, come home. I deleted it immediately, as if that might erase the knot of dread tightening in my chest. But the unease clung to me, growing heavier with each passing moment. The house felt colder, the shadows in the corners darker. The bracelet and Polaroid sat on the table, side by side, as though waiting for me to acknowledge them. I wanted to leave to grab my keys and drive far away from Hollow Pines, but deep down, I knew there was no running from this. Whatever was happening, it was tied to the grave, to the bracelet, to me. I locked myself in my bedroom, determined to sleep. I figured exhaustion had been fueling my paranoia, twisting small, strange events into something bigger. I told myself that if I could just rest, everything would make sense in the morning. But the house wouldn't let me. It started with faint whispers. At first, they sounded like the rustling of leaves outside my window, soft and indistinct. But as I lay there, straining to ignore them, the whispers grew louder, threading through the silence with words I couldn't quite make out. Then came the laughter. Sorry. It echoed down the hall, faint and childlike, the same cold, mocking sound I'd heard the night before. My breath caught in my throat as I sat up, staring at the bedroom door. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a slow, deliberate knock on the door. 3 sharp raps. I didn't move. The knock came again, louder this time, the sound reverberating through the room. My pulse thundered in my ears as I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and crept toward the door, my fingers trembling. I swung it open, dreading to find something waiting for me. But the hallway was empty. I turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness as I scanned the corridor. Everything looked normal at first, but then my light caught something on the floor, a trail of wet footprints, leading from my bedroom door to the living room. My chest tightened. I didn't want to follow them, but it felt as though an invisible hand was pushing me forward, pulling me toward whatever waited at the end of the trail. The footprints stopped in front of the hallway mirror. I stared at my reflection, my breathing shallow. For a moment I thought it was just me, pale and shaken, staring back. But then my reflection smiled. I didn't. Its grin stretched too wide, splitting its face in two, and its eyes darkened, hollowing out into empty voids. My hands clenched around the flashlight as I stumbled back, slamming into the wall. And then, it moved. The reflection pressed its hands against the glass, its expression twisting with rage. You left. Me, it hissed, its voice warped and distorted. You promised. The light flickered, and before I could move, the reflection slammed its fist against the mirror. The glass cracked, spiderwebbing outward, and the sound sent me running. The Polaroid was in my hand again, the shadowy figure in the photo seeming clearer now, its face beginning to emerge from the darkness. Morning came slowly, the weak sunlight barely breaking through the overcast sky. I stepped out of the car and stared at the cemetery gates, my breath visible in the cold air. I didn't know what I was looking for: answers, closure, or maybe just proof that I wasn't losing my mind. I walked back to the grave, the damp earth squelching beneath my feet. The gravestone loomed ahead, its surface cracked and weathered. But this time, there was something different. The bracelet I'd left on the table was now sitting on the headstone, the initials LT, gleaming faintly in the morning light. I reached for it, but before I could touch it, the air around me shifted. The cemetery grew colder, the light dimming as a shadow fell over me. And then I heard it, the voice I'd been dreading. "You shouldn't have come back." I spun around, my heart pounding, but the cemetery was empty. The trees swayed faintly in the breeze, their skeletal branches creaking, but there was no one there. And then I felt it. A hand on my shoulder, cold, impossibly strong. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The figure from the photo stood behind me, its face identical to mine but warped, its features twisted by anger and pain. Its black eyes bore into mine as it whispered, "You're supposed to be here." I stumbled back, my foot catching on the uneven ground. The figure didn't move, its hollow gaze following me as I scrambled to my feet. "You're not real," I said, my voice trembling. "You can't be real." The thing smiled, its teeth sharp and glinting. "Neither are you." The world seemed to tilt, the ground beneath me shifting as the figure lunged. I turned and ran, the wind whipping through the trees as I sprinted back to my car. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figure sitting in the back seat, its grin stretching wider as it whispered, "You can't run from yourself." The figure disappeared when I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop at the side of the road. My breath came in gasps as I clutched the steering wheel, my knuckles white. The empty back seat loomed behind me in the rearview mirror, but even though it was empty now, I could still feel its presence. The silence inside the car was unbearable. I had to go back. I didn't want to, but the pull was undeniable, like a string wrapped tight around my ribs, dragging me back toward the cemetery, toward the grave. The house loomed in darkness when I returned to grab what I needed: my flashlight, a spade from the shed, and the bracelet. The tarnished metal was ice cold in my hand, the initials LT gleaming faintly under the flashlight's beam. My mind screamed at me to leave it behind, to abandon the bracelet and everything it represented. But I couldn't. I slipped it into my pocket and headed back out, the cold night air biting at my skin. The cemetery was deathly quiet when I arrived. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, just the sound of my footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The moon hung low in the sky, casting pale light over the rows of headstones, and the trees seemed to loom closer, their twisted branches reaching like claws. The grave waited for me, half sunken and surrounded by loose dirt. The whispers started again as I approached, faint at first, like the hum of distant voices carried on the wind. But as I stepped closer, the voices grew louder, overlapping into an unintelligible chorus that made my head throb. "Stop," I whispered, clutching my head. "Just stop." But they didn't. I dropped to my knees, the whispers pounding in my skull as I began to dig. The soil was damp and clung to my hands as I clawed at it, deeper and deeper, each handful of dirt feeling heavier than the last. The air grew colder with each movement, and the voices shifted, no longer indistinct, but singular. "Why did you leave me?" The voice was faint but unmistakable. It was my voice. After what felt like hours, my hands hit something solid. My breath hitched as I cleared away the remaining dirt, revealing a small wooden coffin, its surface warped and blackened with age. I hesitated. The whispers grew louder now, insistent and pleading, as if they wanted me to stop. My heart pounded as I reached out, my fingers trembling, and pried the lid open. The stench of decay hit me first, sharp and acrid, making me gag. Inside the coffin lay the Polaroid. Its surface glistened as though it had been submerged in water, the image inside, warped and distorted. I held it up, my chest tightening as I stared at the figure in the photograph. The twin was alone now, standing in the center of the frame. His features were sharper, clearer, the hollow pits of his eyes glinting with malice. And then the figure moved, turning its head toward me. The Polaroid slipped from my hands, and the coffin lid slammed shut with a deafening bang. The ground trembled beneath me, the dirt shifting and heaving as though something massive was stirring beneath it. I scrambled back, my flashlight beam darting wildly, catching glimpses of shadowy shapes rising from the soil. The whispers turned into a roar, a cacophony of voices screaming in unison, and then he emerged. The figure rose from the open grave, his movements unnaturally smooth, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. He was identical to me in every way, same face, same build, but his eyes were endless voids, and his grin was a jagged slash across his face. "You shouldn't have left me," he said, his voice a distorted echo of mine. I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the ground, my body paralyzed as he stepped closer. "You promised." His words sent a jolt of memory through me. Images flashed in my mind, 2 children playing. On the porch steps, my mother holding the bracelet, tears streaming down her face. A voice saying, "I don't want to share." And then the other boy, screaming as he was pulled away, dragged into the dark. I had forgotten him. The truth slammed into me like a freight train, leaving me breathless. He wasn't just a shadow or a ghost. He was me, or at least a part of me that had been buried, both in the grave and in my mind. I stumbled back, my foot catching on the edge of the grave. The bracelet burned in my pocket as though it were alive, and instinctively I pulled it out. His grin faltered as he saw it, the black pits of his eyes narrowing. "Give it back," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. The bracelet felt like it was pulsing in my hand, the initials LT, glowing faintly in the dark. The air grew colder as he advanced, his grin returning, wider than ever. "You don't deserve it," he said. "It was always mine." I didn't know what to do. The bracelet burned hotter with each passing second, the whispers now screaming in my ears. And then he lunged. The impact knocked me to the ground, the flashlight rolling out of my hand and casting wild, flickering beams across the cemetery. His hands closed around my throat, icy and impossibly strong, his face inches from mine. "You don't belong here," he growled, his grin splitting wider. "This is my life." I struggled against him, my hands clawing at the dirt, desperate for anything I could use. My fingers closed around the Polaroid, the damp paper cold and slippery in my grip. With a scream, I shoved it against his face. The effect was immediate. He recoiled, his hands releasing me as he staggered back, clawing at his face. The Polaroid burned like acid, the image distorting as smoke hissed from his skin. I scrambled to my feet, clutching the bracelet. "Stay where you belong," I said, my voice trembling as I held the bracelet high. He screamed, his voice splintering into 1,000 echoes as the ground beneath him opened up. Shadows erupted from the grave, wrapping around him like vines, dragging him back into the earth. His eyes locked on mine as he sank, his grin twisting into a snarl. "You'll never be free," he hissed. And then he was gone. The silence was overwhelming. I stood there, frozen, staring at the grave as the last of the shadows disappeared into the earth. My heart pounded in my chest, and my hands were trembling, the bracelet clutched so tightly in, my fist that the tarnished metal bit into my skin. For the first time in what felt like hours, the air felt still. No whispers, no voices, just the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. I should have felt relieved, but instead I was hollow. The grave was closed now, the dirt settling as though it had never been disturbed. The Polaroid lay on the ground at my feet, its surface blank, the image burned away. I picked it up with shaking fingers, staring at the empty white square. My twin was gone. When I returned to the house, the first rays of dawn were creeping over the horizon, casting the rooms in pale, golden light. It felt strange to be back in the quiet, familiar space after everything that had happened, as though I'd stepped into a dream. The torn Polaroid was gone from the coffee table, and the scratches I'd seen on the walls the night before had vanished. For the first time in days, the house felt normal. I headed to the bathroom to wash the dirt from my hands, my reflection catching my eye in the mirror. I froze. It looked like me. Same face, same tired eyes, but something about it was off. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A faint delay in the movements, a lingering expression that didn't quite match my own. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the glass. The reflection smiled. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The smile disappeared, replaced by the same blank, exhausted expression I'd seen when I first walked in. Shaking my head, I told myself it was just paranoia. Everything that had happened, the stress, the lack of sleep, it was messing with my mind. But the feeling of being watched stayed with me all day. The first real sign that something wasn't right came that night. I was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the television, when the lights began to flicker. I grabbed my phone to check for a power outage, but the screen wouldn't turn on. And then I saw my reflection in the black screen. It was smiling again. This time, the grin didn't fade. It grew wider, splitting my face in two, the teeth sharp and glinting. My real face was frozen in shock, my mouth slightly open, but the reflection moved on. Its own, raising a hand and pressing it against the glass of the screen. "Thank you," it whispered, its voice faint but unmistakable. I dropped the phone, the screen shattering as it hit the floor. When I looked up, the reflection was gone. The next few days were a waking nightmare. Mirrors, windows, even polished surfaces, they all betrayed me. The reflection appeared again. And again, always smiling, always watching. It spoke in whispers, low and mocking, its words threading into my mind like poison. "You set me free. It's your turn now." I stopped looking at mirrors, stopped looking at anything that might show me my reflection. But it didn't matter. I could feel it watching me, its presence growing stronger, its laughter echoing in the empty house. Then came the final message. It was scrawled on the wall above my bed, the letters jagged and uneven, carved into the plaster. "You'll never leave." The house felt colder than ever, the air heavy and oppressive. I barely slept, jumping at every sound, every shadow that moved out of the corner of my eye. And then, one night, it all stopped. No whispers, no laughter, no flickering lights or reflections that moved on their own. The silence was almost worse. I woke the next morning feeling disoriented, as though I'd been asleep for years. The sunlight streamed through the windows, and for the first time in weeks, the house felt warm. I made my way to the bathroom, half expecting to see the reflection waiting for me, but it didn't appear. My face in the mirror was just my face. No delay, no sinister grin, just me. I let out a shaky breath, relief washing over me. Maybe it was over. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something in the corner of the mirror, a small crack, barely visible, running down the edge of the glass. The house seemed to have settled, the oppressive weight lifting. I convinced myself that I'd won, that whatever had haunted me was finally gone. But then the dreams started. At first, they were faint, just flashes of images, dark trees, the grave, the hollow pits of my twin's eyes. But each night, they grew stronger, more vivid. In the most recent dream, I was standing in front of the hallway mirror, staring at my reflection. My twin's voice echoed around me, faint and distant. "You took my place," he whispered. But not for long. I jolted awake, drenched in sweat, the faint sound of laughter still ringing in my ears. I don't know how much longer I can take this. The cracks in the mirrors have started to spread, weaving intricate patterns across the glass. Sometimes when I walk past, I catch a glimpse of him, not in the reflection, but behind it. He's waiting. I can feel it. And sometimes when the house is silent and the shadows stretch too long, I hear his voice again. You'll come back. Have you ever discovered something about your past that shook you to your core? Tell us your story in the comments.